CBS, Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor with my colleague and friend Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations. We're very pleased to go right to London to speak to Natasha Hausdorff. And she's an attorney, but most importantly, legal director at UK Lawyers for Israel. Natasha, a very good day to you. Since last we spoke, there's been a change of government in London, and the parliament is now dominated by more than 400 members of the Labour Party, led by Sir Keir Starmer. The significance for American audience to understand is if Labour wants it, Labour gets it. There's no divided house here. The numbers are overwhelming. What is the significance of the change of government when it comes to what we are focusing on, anti-Semitism and what you'd have to say, alienation of Israel? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. It's so good to be with you, despite the circumstances, because you are right that the Labour Party being in government does mean potentially significant change with respect to the UK's policy toward Israel. Your viewers, listeners may recall that the Labour Party has had a troubled history with anti-Semitism, especially under its former leader, Jeremy Corbyn. There was, I think it's permissible to say, rife anti-Semitism amongst many Labour Party members. Under Keir Starmer, who has now become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, an awful lot of the Labour Party's policies vis-à-vis Israel and the Middle East as a whole are seen as pretty hostile towards the Jewish state. We've seen already the refunding of UNRWA. Those funds from the UK had been suspended previously on the basis of many reports, including from UN Watch, about UNRWA's complicity in the 7th of October, not to mention, of course, the education programs that UNRWA puts forward, the indoctrination towards terrorism that it is responsible for. So we've already seen the UK renewing its funding of that UN organisation that promotes those troubling perspectives. And there is also a lot of talk about renewed efforts here towards an arms embargo against Israel and calls for the UK to recognise Palestine as a state. I think we have to watch this space, but there's certainly been a significant change and I think a trajectory which should be somewhat concerning for all of us who understand the importance of the United Kingdom standing by the one democracy in the Middle East.
Malcolm?
So the ICJ, International Court of Justice, which you actually addressed on your last appearance here, has come full circle now, and we saw the orders to tell Israel to take immediate measures to prevent acts of genocide, etc. Could you elaborate what the specific measures they've mandated and how you believe Israel should respond, how friends of Israel should respond, the implications for it on the international scene?
Of course. So up until the latest development, we've had a series of provisional measures by the International Court of Justice in the context of the claim or the action that South Africa had brought against Israel, alleging that it was committing genocide. And albeit that those provisional measures orders have been subject to widespread misinterpretation, I think it's fair to say that on a whole, in general, they were ordering Israel to comply with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, and Israel's position has been consistent that it is already doing so, and so there was no particular change mandated. Fast forward to Friday afternoon, and the court delivered something that is subject to a separate set of proceedings. It delivered a non-binding advisory opinion, which had been requested of it by the General Assembly all the way back in December 2022. And this was an opinion that was sought that essentially accused Israel of a host of violations of international law. And the General Assembly asked the court to opine, to give its opinion on what the legal consequences of those purported violations were. So the 32 states that sponsored this resolution at the UN General Assembly, about 3/4 of those don't have any diplomatic relations with Israel. Some of those don't even recognize the state of Israel, but they'd certainly put forward politicized allegations, which in delivering its opinion, the court has essentially embraced. There may well be those listening who have seen reports on Friday and over the weekend and over the course of this week of the court having essentially declared Israeli settlements illegal. And demanded reparations on the part of the Palestinians. I mean, the most important thing to recognize about this opinion is that it is not binding. And in that vein, it is essentially as weighty or as valuable as the accuracy of its factual basis, as the strength of its legal reasoning. And in both of those respects, this opinion is sorely lacking. UK Lawyers for Israel actually, together with Elnet, put in a submission to the International Court of Justice highlighting the significant problems with the factual basis that the court was adopting to opine on these legal questions. It did a very similar thing in 2004 when it delivered an advisory opinion, so-called wall opinion, which was on Israel's security barrier. It didn't mention terrorism in that opinion at all, even though this was a barrier that was built in response to waves of suicide bombings that Israel was experiencing in the run-up to its construction. It didn't mention terrorism in the context of its assessments last week either. And in fact, it has based its determinations on many pages of UN reports that allege untrue, malicious allegations against Israel. And it has not only adopted those wholesale, but also deployed extremely questionable analyses of international law in seeking to rule that Israel's activities are unlawful. Now, an awful lot of this seems to be driven by the president of the court, President Salam, who has a viciously anti-Israel track record. He ran twice for the prime minister of Lebanon, which, of course, inevitably links himself pretty strongly with Hezbollah, who's been firing onto Israel since the 7th of October. But he also has a pretty strong track record of calling Israel a terror state, of accusing it of apartheid and terrorism, while he was the Lebanese ambassador to the United Nations. So I would certainly argue very strongly that under the rules of the court, he would be required to recuse himself. He's not done that. Instead, it seems that he's been driving this opinion forward. It's an opinion also that essentially eradicates Israel off of the map in determining that the Palestinian territory constitutes a single territorial unit. It says the contiguity and integrity of that has to be preserved and respected. It also, and this is pretty significant in terms of the political ramifications, utterly trashes the Oslo Accords, the recognized framework that the international community has approved, has endorsed, has embraced for the resolution of this conflict through bilateral negotiations in good faith. All of that has been thrown out of the window by an opinion which has essentially given the Palestinian leadership all of the marbles. It has said there is no need to negotiate over anything. It has plainly hamstrung the Palestinian leadership for any future negotiations, but it's also, I think, indicated to Israel that there's no point in entering into any internationally approved agreement if these agreements aren't worth the paper they are written on and are simply torn up by opinions of the International Court of Justice in this fashion. So all of this is very much another example of this phenomenon of lawfare that I know we've discussed before. And it is snowballing. This opinion doesn't of itself have legal consequences, but it will doubtless be used, deployed. There will be UN resolutions sought off the back of it. There may also be sanctions sought and arms embargoes imposed and other repercussions, also at national level. It may very well be that we'll see this opinion being used in order to seek to justify, arrest warrants against Israelis. What it has also called for, and perhaps the last point that I'll pick up on, is the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. It has called for the evacuation of settlers. It is asking that Israel ensure that the West Bank is Judenrein by removing people from their homes, families, of course, who have been living peacefully in a recognized framework under the Oslo Accords, which established areas A, B, and C.
30 seconds. Please go ahead.
Well, I can leave it there. The final thing I would say is that the dissenting judge's opinion, the vice president of the court, Sebutinde, should be required reading for anyone that wants to understand where this court went so badly wrong and how the proper approach ought to have looked. And I think she's extremely brave. She has articulated succinctly a real tour de force of the proper analysis of these issues.
Natasha Hausdorff is an attorney in London and legal director at the UK Lawyers for Israel, Malcolm Hoenlein. I'm John Batchelor.
Stay tuned for more of CBS Eye on the World with John Batchelor.